Hello, fellow Cricketeers. So tonight I wanted to go over a little process I use to take things I've got laying around the house that I've done with other arts and crafts projects and turn them into digital assets that we can use with our Cricut. And in this example, I've got some stencils. These are little 3" by 4" or so stencils that I had a set of that I bought many years ago, and they just kind of been laying around for whenever I wanted to use anything. On the screen you see there's 3 examples of them, and then this little card here on the right kind of shows all of the stencils that were in that pack. You can find these at any craft store. And this is going to be a process that works for basically any piece of paper, drawing or shape or whatever it is you want to work with to turn it into a design for your Cricut. So I'm going to be using Adobe Illustrator for this, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about Illustrator in general. I'm not an expert in Illustrator. I just know a few kind of steps and a few tricks along the way. And this process can be a little involved. So you might want to, if you want to pause and review or ask any questions in the comments, I'll try to answer anything I can, because this kind of a process can be a little involved at times. So I would try to go kind of slow and deliberate to make sure all the steps are clear. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out and I will do anything I can to answer what I can. So we're going to start by doing a scan of these objects, and I'm using a basic Epson flatbed scanner. The settings for our scanner are going to be black and white, because we need to provide the computer Illustrator a high contrast image, and that's easiest to do when you only have 2 colors basically. So we're using black and white. We're going to do a 300 DPI. It's kind of on the high end of the DPI, but I like making sure we have a little wiggle room of clarity with higher DPIs. And on file format, I'm going to use TIFF as the format. You don't have to. I find it works best for me, but a JPEG or a standard image file may work as well for you. I just prefer TIFF, and I get the best results in my experience with that file format. So we've gone ahead and we've scanned this in. My scanner allows me to kind of select an area to scan, so that's what this box up here is. I didn't have to scan the edges of just extra space we don't need. Most scanners will allow you to do that as well. So once you've got your image selected and your settings there, you scan it into wherever you go. I'm scanning this into my pictures folder. Of course, you have to make sure you kind of take note of where you're scanning your files to, so you know where to find them later. So now we're going to pop into Illustrator. I'm going to make a brand new image, or a brand new canvas rather. I'm just going to make it a 4" here by 4" because that's about the size of the stencil. It gives it a little room on the edge to work with. So we're going to go ahead and create our blank canvas here. And here we go. And in Illustrator, we have a few steps to do. We have to basically place the image we scanned into this canvas, and then have Illustrator kind of draw around it and trace the images out. Okay, so I'm going to go to File, and we're going to go to Place. We're going to select this snowflake.tiff that I've created, and we place that into our canvas. And this is the image that I've scanned. It's a little snowflake design from those stencils. And what we're trying to do here is we want Illustrator, or any vector program you have can do the same thing, but again, I'm just working with Illustrator since I'm a little more familiar with it. But basically any of the programs out there have a tracing ability. And so what we're trying to do is have Illustrator come through automatically and trace these little shapes that were cut out of the stencil. And we're going to get them to do that for us. The program's going to do that tracing for us. So with our image here selected, we're going to use what Illustrator calls image trace. And you can get to that a few different ways, but under the window menu, there is an image trace option here. So I'm going to go ahead and activate the image trace window, which pops on the right-hand side of my screen. And you'll see we have several options here. I'm going to start by selecting a preset. And like I said, I scan this as black and white. We want to give the computer as few colors as possible, because all we want it to do is distinguish between the edges of these shapes. And if it can only have 2 colors to look at, it makes it a lot easier and a lot cleaner in the end result. So we're going to start with a default setting of 3 colors. It's going to do its little processing here. As I make any change to a setting, it's going to have to do a reprocessing, which is fine. And depending on your computer, it takes a couple of seconds here. So once that's done, we've got 3 colors here selected. I'm going to just knock it down 1 more to 2, because again, it's just going to give us a little bit of a clarity when we just tell it it's either black or white, essentially. And so again, it's going to do its process. You'll see this image change very slightly, kind of got a little bit more clean if you saw that change happen real quick. So now we've got basically 2 colors it's looking at. And then we have a couple more options I'm gonna talk about. I'm not gonna go into a lot of detail because it does get kind of complicated. But we have a path option and a corners option. These two things basically tell the computer how detailed of a design or how detailed of a line do you want. I generally find that for something like this, it's not too complex of an image, that about 50% on both of those is more than enough. If you have a lot of angles, a lot of curves, then more corners will help kind of make the image tracing more smooth. But you can try it at 50%, give it a shot. If it doesn't look the way you want it to, go back and try it again at different higher levels of paths and corners or lower levels and see. You can see how that changes for you. So I'm again just keeping it here at the 50% mark. And once you have your settings here, again, we went to a custom preset of 3 colors, which we then knocked down to 2, and then we just have our path and our corner. Once you have all that taken care of, we're going to go up to the Object menu in Illustrator, come down to Image Trace here, and we're going to go to Expand, which basically just tells it take the options and expand it across the whole image and give me my final result. And it takes a few seconds. And we have it done. And what you'll see here is we have all these little blue boxes. Those are all the curves and lines and paths that it made based on what it did. It came through and it said, okay, I see this is a change in color from black to white. I'm going to, outline that image for you, or that piece of the image. And so that's created little outlines for everything in our stencil. Okay, so when we look at this image, we actually have 2 images. If you think of it as the computer came through and took what we see here, which looks like a stencil, and it traced around the inside of each of these little cutouts. So we have each of the individual cutouts as one layer, and then we have this dark gray layer with the pieces cut out from it as a second layer. And to see that, what we can do is in Illustrator, we want to make sure we're on our direct selection tool. And by direct selection, it allows us to select all of the different objects. If you think about it, each of these white areas that the computer traced out for us is an independent object, okay? And then this gray selection is a single object as well with these things cut out of it, okay? So I'm gonna grab this gray layer here. I'm gonna kind of nudge it to the side to maybe let you see a little better that we've got, this is a piece that was cut out, and this is, the gray area that it was cut out from. So again, we have these 2 layers, and both of those are usable as individual images inside of Design Space, okay? The difference being, when you use the gray layer, all of the little pieces that are cut out are static, right? Like the distance between this one and that one is static because of the gray area in between it. When you use the other layer, which has just the individual, just the individual pieces, you can actually take one of these and move it around anywhere you want to make that, to give it a whole different shape. Okay, so I'm going to undo that little nudge there. And I want to make these 2 separate files to send over to Cricut so we can use them, kind of independently rather. So what we're going to do is I'm going to, I've got my selection here, the gray area selection. To make sure I can make 2 different areas of this, I'm going to take this gray thing, this gray layer, I'm going to go to my edit menu, and I'm going to cut that out and put it into basically into the clipboard, right? So if I hit cut, that goes away. I see now just these other pieces that are left over, and those, the gray area, the dark gray area that had the thing is cut out of it, is in my clipboard, and we're going to come back to that in a few minutes. So from here, I have my direct selection tool selected, and if you may have noticed, there's a little kind of artifact on the edges, right? If I do a little selection box here, you'll see these 2 lines came up, which is basically the edge of where we scanned. I don't need those. I don't want those to be cut anytime I use this, so I'm just going to select them like I just did and hit delete. Those go away. And what I'm left with now are all the little pieces that were cut out of the stencil. To make these more visible, you can see, I know you can barely see them, and there's not really any line around them, so all we have is this kind of gray fill, and I want to make a line around them. And so when you select the objects in Illustrator, you have 2 options. You have a stroke and a fill. So the light gray is the fill, and the little blue line that is kind of showing where it would be the stroke, like where the pen had gone and made that tracing mark. So with all of these selected, I'm going to go to the Properties panel in Illustrator. I'm going to choose the stroke option, and you see this box with a red arrow through it means that there is no stroke currently set. So I'm going to open that up and choose black for my stroke. It defaults to a 1 pixel size, which in reality what we're doing is pretty large. So I'm going to cut this down to 1/4 of a pixel, so 0.25 is what I'm going to work with here. And so now if I unselect, you'll see everything now has a little black line around it, which is what the Cricut's going to use to make its cuts. So I'm going to save this. This is kind of layer number 1. We're going to save this as our first copy, and we're going to call this Snowflake Knockout, because that's kind of what I'm thinking about it as, the knocked out pieces. And remember, in Cricut, we want to use SVG as the file format, because that's what Cricut likes to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. I already had one done, so I'm just going to replace it. And the default options for all this is fine, so just hit OK. And now we have this version of the file ready. Now, if you remember, we had 2 layers, and I'm going to go back to what we did before where we cut that other piece out, and it's on our clipboard right now. So I'm going to just make space for it. So I'm going to, again, select all of this stuff by drawing a box around it, and I'm just going to delete it all. And I'm going to go back to our edit menu where before we chose cut, right, to make sure that we took that dark gray piece and cut it away. We're now going to paste it back. And so now we have just this piece, which is, again, like the scan of the piece of paper with all those pieces of the snowflake kind of punched out of it, of our stencil. So now I've got this piece, and I want to save this as an SVG. And so I'm going to go ahead and do a file and a save as. And this time, instead of knockout, I'm going to call it the snowflake stencil. And again, we're going to keep it as an SVG. Hit save. And now we have both versions of what we just scanned ready for Cricut. So popping over to Design Space now. We're in a canvas here, and you may be familiar with how to upload photos and images. So we're going to go ahead and upload. I'm going to choose an image. I'm going to go ahead and browse to it. And in our pictures folder, we have the stencil and the knockout. So I'm going to start with our stencil. Because it's an SVG, Cricut's going to love it. It's going to know exactly what it is. It's going to give us very little options because it's like, okay, I got you. You've given me everything I need to know about it. So we don't have to do any kind of erasing or cropping or anything. It's all ready to go. So we're going to save that image. And you'll see it's right there. And this is another one I've done in the past, but this is the one we just did. I'm going to upload another image and browse. And this time I'm going to choose our knockout. And again, same thing. It's an SVG file, which is what Cricut really loves. And you'll notice like all these little pieces are there. And so we'll be able to actually manipulate all of those individual pieces of this design separately with that file. So we're going to save that. And so we have our 2 options, and I'm going to select both of them so we can kind of put them both into our canvas and give them, so we can kind of see them side by side and how they're different. But these are the 2 images that we just kind of made from scanning a stencil into our computer. I'm going to insert those in. And here we have our 2 options, okay? So if you notice, if I click on the dark gray one, which again, that's the stencil that has all the pieces, you can kind of see the grid through that. We don't have any options to ungroup or anything, because if you look at our layers panel over here, the snowflake stencil file is a single image. It's, again, just one big image that we can work with. However, if you look at the knockout, you'll notice every individual shape is its own kind of layer. And if I select it right now, as you may know, whenever you import an SVG that has multiple objects, it all comes kind of grouped together. And so what we would need to do is, once it's selected, we'll come over to our ungroup option in the layers panel and ungroup it. And now every individual shape from that stencil is an object that we can manipulate independently. So gives us lots of options of either just cutting out this complete thing and making it happen, or using only a few of the circles from it or a few of the shapes from any of these objects. So by using the stencil option, we get a lot of options on how to use these shapes in our projects. You can decide whichever way you want, and what you'll need to know, of course, is if you use this version, you'll get just those shapes cut out, right? If you use this, the dark version, it's going to cut the whole square out as well as all the individual shapes, right? So you want to make sure you're aware of that. One thing you might try to do is use our contour option, right? Which is the option if you have a layer selected. You go down here to contour, and you can choose different aspects of it to cut or not cut by turning it off or on. So if I turn off the big gray background and cut this out, I now have this object. Everything is proportional to each other. Everything, all the objects are there, but the big gray kind of background or the square is no longer being cut out. Again, we did that with the contour option, where you can choose individual aspects of an image to cut or not cut. Okay, it's still one big grouped image. I can't manipulate individual pieces of this. I can scale the entire thing, but I can't manipulate these things like I can with this version of the file. And lastly, when we go to make it, you'll see what happens when I just do a makeup. Remember, we ungrouped these so we can move them individually. If I go over here to make it, it puts it on two mats because, again, they were different colors. And if you look at mat 2, you may notice this happens a lot with these objects you have. It just puts every object independently because they were not grouped in any way. So if you wanted to use these objects and keep them kind of where they were, you would need to either keep them all grouped or actually use the attach function for those individual objects. So just to kind of reiterate, this version, the knockout version we did, treats every shape as its own independent object, and you would have to attach them together to keep it cutting to this exact kind of proportion on the mat. Whereas this was our stencil option. We have removed, using the contour option, I'll put it back just to kind of show you visually, that background you can take off or not, and it does treat it all as one object. So now when we go to make it, you'll see like it's going to show you, it's going to cut that square out of the outside, and if you want that, that's great. But if you don't want it, again, you can use that contour option to remove it. And then on our next map, because we attached all of these pieces together, it'll kind of cut it in that same proportional, relational positioning. So that's how we take a stencil and turn it into a digital piece of art that we can work with in Design Space. I know this was a complicated one. There's a lot of steps to this. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments below, and I will do everything I can to answer and help you if you have any questions along the way of trying this yourself. Have a great night.